Welcome to today's episode of Wild Rivers Podcast. So today we are fortunate to be joined by Lefi Tausaga. Did I pronounce that right after all these years?
That's right. That's right.
So Lefi is a forester. He's also counted as one of my brothers from growing up high school days, and we won't get into that conversation today, but we do go a little ways back. Lefi's out of Roseburg, Oregon, so he's down here this morning, worked out with us, and has graced us with his presence and knowledge about forestry. But before we get into that conversation, I kind of want to, one of the things I find that's just really, I don't know if I use the word fascinating, but just really cool about the group of, especially men, but people we've been blessed to be around, is there's such a commonality. There's a commonality of faith and family and just enjoying kind of a homesteading lifestyle and hunting and the outdoors and, raising our families. Like, we're all within a year or two in age. We all have similar age kids. We all work for ourselves or some variant of, entrepreneurial. It's just really cool to have like-minded people that we get to do life with and hang out. So anyway, Lefi, do you want to give a brief introduction to your background, both as a family man, but also, forestry and...
Sure. Yeah. Grew up in Southern Oregon. One of my best friends was a son of a logger. And so, being exposed to working in the woods and logging at an early age, it's kind of what sparked my interest originally. Being able to run a chainsaw in middle school is kind of a cool thing, And so that's where sort of the journey into forestry really started for me. And then, college after that, and
So you went to Oregon State.
Yep. College of Forestry at Oregon State.
And you played rugby while you were there.
I did play rugby. The pitch was right across the street from the College of Forestry, and so it made it convenient. But yeah, really good program. At the time, it was, best in the country for forestry and world renowned as far as the research that was taking place there. And so really, really good place to be if you were wanting to learn about forestry.
Well, let's circle back to the forestry conversation in a minute. Let's unpack a little bit more about just who you are, your family. You live in Roseburg. What does day-to-day life outside of work look like?
So, my wife and I, we've got 5 kids. We've got a little homestead up in Roseburg, and so we've got the layers, the meat chickens. Our family cow recently had a calf, so we're into milk now. Wife's milking the cow every morning, and our son's got a 4-H project with his market hogs. The girls are into dance, and we've got baseball, and so just a really busy at the house, but also busy just with sports and extracurricular activities. And so that really takes up a bunch of our time. And so I think we're always trying to balance, what we've got going on at the house with what we've got going on outside of that. Well,
I think one thing that was interesting, just thinking back a couple of years when I was in the middle of kind of some of the health transition that I had and thinking about how, changing my perspective on how I looked at food and different things. You were one of the handful of people who was like, dude, look at what you're eating and think about protein and where it's coming from and eat a couple of pounds of meat every day. And we had some fun conversations, but you were one of the handful of people who helped get my wheels turning. And I know that's a big focus in your guys' world too.
It is. And I think it started, similar to a lot of people who have that mindset, at least for us and, some of the folks that we hang out with, was in that time of COVID, when people had time to kind of think about things that they normally didn't. And that's kind of where our homestead journey started. And so that's where we started looking more into, what are we eating? What are we putting into our bodies? What is it doing to us? And, along with that, there's a bunch of other stuff, but starting to realize that, what you put into your body food-wise, maybe you don't need other things to kind of help get you where you need to be.
Don't need steroids. No, I'm kidding.
I'll jump in a little bit because Lefi and I just met this morning.
Yeah.
But, we started a little later than we normally do, 7 a.m. because you had to drive 2 hours to get here. But not only did you drive 2 hours, you got up extra early so you could go to 6 a.m. worship service at the church here locally that you hadn't been to in years, just so you could, do that before you came to work out with us. So that says a lot about you even before you showed up. I heard from Chris that's where you're coming from. And then you stepped right into the workout today and did an awesome job, and we had a lot of fun. And yeah.
No, thanks. It was awesome. Applegate Christian Fellowship there, they have their morning worship. And that was, when I was living down here, that was a big part of my daily routine was, on the way to the office, stop in there and, worship, and, take time to be at the Lord's table. And so just a really awesome way to start the day and to kind of set the tone for the day. And so being able to have the opportunity to do that this morning and then have a great workout after that was awesome. So,
and then sharing 24 eggs.
And then eating, my weight in eggs.
Chris made us 24 eggs today for 3 days. Which I never thought there was a limit to how many eggs I could eat, but I found it this morning.
Sorry, guys. I think we all did.
We got the protein. Yeah.
Anyway.
No, that was good. Well,
awesome. Well, thanks for that kind of brief introduction. I think before we jump into the forestry conversation and some of that, I think one of the things that we've been trying to do, on this podcast, you and I, is, both check in on goals and different things. But I had something I just wanted to share kind of briefly this morning that God put in my heart about a week ago. And when I was listening to the word as I was driving over here this morning, it hit me again as I was listening to the Psalms, and it was the word Thanksgiving. And, we associate that automatically with obviously a U.S. holiday, but what hit me this morning was this idea that in our prayer life, in our relationship with the Lord, a heart of thanksgiving. And I think about it with my own kids. The word says that, that God is our Father in heaven, that we've been adopted into his family. Then I think about my own relationship with my own kids, and I think about when they have a heart of thanksgiving, when they're asking for things or doing things, or just as they're going about their day, like how much that brings me joy as their father. And I was thinking about this season, is my heart one that is, has gratitude on the tongue constantly? Do I show my gratitude? Am I, grateful for the multitude of blessings that have been poured out in my life, way beyond just like salvation and promise of heaven? And it just hit me just like a weight today that this spring's been extra busy. I've been working a lot of late nights, a lot of early mornings, dealing with a lot of challenges work-wise, then everything that flows over into family and everything else from that. And I'm like, oh my goodness, it has been a while since I've been as grateful as I should be or had that true heart of thanksgiving. So I guess I just wanted to share that this morning, both as asking for accountability to make sure I stay in that place, but also just that I think we can all benefit from it. And the picture of me being a father with my kids hit me so hard this morning as I was thinking about that. I'm like, oh man, when my kids are grateful, there's nothing I won't do to bless them.
Yeah.
But when they're entitled, there's almost nothing I won't do to discipline them, So
it's interesting when you texted me that this morning, you sent me a really nice long text just of what was on your heart, probably while you were driving, I'm assuming.
Voice to text, yes.
Yeah. But, we got in the kind of the meat of the workout, this morning, it kind of changed my attitude, and I was like, man, that's a really great perspective. I'm just so thankful we are all three here getting this opportunity to work out right now and do something hard.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Like we're all physically fit enough to do it. We're healthy enough to do it. We're
Hallelujah.
here. We have the time to do it. Our wives are managing things, on the home front so we can do it. It's like, man, we have so much to be thankful for.
No kidding. And to top it off, we had such a gorgeous morning this morning out here in the Applegate.
Oh my goodness.
And everything. Good night. Anyway.
Well, Forest. We're in the Pacific Northwest. There's forests here, I hear.
There are. We've got a few trees, yeah.
Well, I would love it as we get this rolling, because in my business, I do get to deal with forestry, not every transaction, but, enough that I'm fairly familiar with the economic dance or some of the model of it. But I'd love if you could take a minute and just ask some of the questions that as someone from Texas who doesn't have a forestry background that you're curious about. I'd love for you to put that on the table here and let's just talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I still consider myself an outsider to the Northwest. Haven't even been here 2 years yet. So I'm still kind of eyes wide open to everything. And everything's cool to me still. It's all new. But the forestry thing in particular, like, from an outsider's perspective, you think of the Northwest and you kind of think like towns that were built on either logging or commercial fishing, at least historically, right? And even here, like in Medford or Roseburg, you have a lot of that old, industrial infrastructure to process timber and different industries kind of built up around it. And then obviously you've got the logging going on in the field. And so I guess like break it down for me, like maybe a little bit of the history of it and how you kind of see, the history to where we're at today from like a 30,000 foot perspective on what's going on in the Northwest woods.
Sure. That's a
We could be here for a long time.
That's a tall
just
order.
unpacking that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it really is. You look at the I-5 corridor and you've got Medford and Grants Pass and Glendale and Roseburg and just all these towns going up the highway there. And each one of those towns had a bustling logging industry, and with multiple mills. And, up until, the 80s and then definitely into the 90s, the Forest Service, the federal forest that we have, they were harvesting a lot of timber and enough timber to sustain all of those facilities and manufacturers.
And most of that was old growth.
A lot of it was, yep.
Yeah, so original kind
the
of...
original,
first cut.
natural forests, exactly. Yeah. And so everybody was cutting big logs. A lot of the logs that you see going up and down the highway now on a log truck would, there wasn't much use for that. Small diameter wood. But fast forward to the mid 90s, 94, the spotted owl comes out. It gets added to the Endangered Species Act. There's all these new rules and different protections. So
maybe to take a way step back on the spotted owl, because I'm at least familiar with it enough to understand when you say that, kind of what that means. But like spotted owl is an owl that's native to the Northwest woods and a lot of the big timber country, was kind of recognized as, an inhabitant of that old growth forest.
Yep.
And simultaneously was recognized by different folks as like, hey, with the harvest of the old growth, we're losing spotted owl habitat, and thus it's become a point where it's critical and we need to do something about it. Is that a fair setup?
Yeah, I think so, partially, but...
there's a lot of politics involved.
There's tons of politics. There's two extreme sides of everything.
Exactly.
Right?
There's two very extreme sides and views on that topic. I think it was I think there was a little bit of truth on both sides. But the biggest thing is, at that time, harvest levels dramatically decreased. And so
94 was like, that's when it happened.
And so you see this decline,
That primarily impacted public holdings, or was it public and private?
Public. And so, you see the Forest Service, dramatically reduce their annual harvest levels. You see, mills and then logging companies start to close their doors just because there isn't enough wood out there to sustain all these companies. And so now you've got a private industry that's sort of tasked to shoulder the load to kind of provide the wood for everyone else. And that's kind of where we're at today. Seeing this decrease in federal harvest levels, and now here in the state of Oregon, the majority, over 75% of the annual harvest is done on private forest lands. And so just kind of a fast forward, present day, about 75% of Oregon's timber harvest is on private timberland. And then, that 25% is cut up between the feds and the state, and then some tribal ground as well.
And is most of what's being cut today what you would call like second harvest or second cut?
Second growth is what you would call it. And so there's very little old growth still being harvested. There are, some pieces that folks will get into every once in a while. But there isn't, at least on the private ground, there almost all of the private timberland now is second growth. It's been harvested before. It's coming up on its second or third rotation.
Which is how long?
It really depends. And so here in Southern Oregon, in the Applegate Valley, you're looking at probably 50 years until you have like a merchantable tree to harvest. And so, we've got these shallow rocky soils down here. We've got intense heat. It just takes
Relative. I'm from Texas.
Sure.
So.
Yes.
For an evergreen tree,
I
it's
get a little
intense heat.
offended when people say intense heat here.
for growing trees.
55 degrees when you wake up in August. I'm like, so what if it's going to be 100?
Okay, fair enough. But when it comes to growing trees, it's a slow growing.
It is a hotter
environment.
climate for the Northwest.
Yes.
To give some context, like around here, like 3 to 4% growth rate per year is pretty common. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. You could, as you go further north, the trees grow a lot faster. Even in Roseburg, you can have a 35, 40-year-old merchantable stand of timber in the right areas.
Yeah, as you go towards the coast and you go north, the
More
growth
rain.
rate increases significantly.
Milder climate, faster growing everything.
Yep.
Well, the stressors on the trees. There's less stressors on the trees from the heat and drought.
Yeah.
And just the rain too. And you get up into the Willamette Valley and you have a 20 plus foot, organic layer of soil. The trees are blowing up out there. And so the growth rates, and the harvest rotations get a little shorter the further north you get, just because of the ideal growing conditions. So in Southern Oregon, it takes some time to grow a merchantable tree.
Yeah, as we're talking about this process of like, historically they were cutting old growth, and then after the old growth cuts, they were replanting after that, or they were letting it kind of come back a natural stand, or?
So I don't know exactly when the reforestation was a law, required by law. But yes, I mean, now, whenever there's a timber harvest and that area is reduced below, the state required stocking level, you're required to plant. And so a lot of the industrial lands that you see, they use the clear cut method for timber harvest. And so because of that, it obviously doesn't meet that required stocking level. So they are required by law to replant within 2 years.
And they generally are replanting just a straight Doug fir.
Yes.
Most of the time is what I
So I think that's a good lead in to talk for a moment about species and what we actually have in the forest in Oregon. You want to unpack what's common and what is most valuable at the same time?
Yeah, and I think the most common species planted as well as the highest value is Douglas fir. You go to Home Depot and you see the lumber, you see the beams, and it's almost all Douglas fir. There are some whitewoods, some hemlock and white fir studs, and then the kind of the specialty cedar products and that type of thing. But for Oregon, I mean, the Douglas fir is the state tree, and for good reason. It is the highest value species out there.
Well, and around here we also have a lot of pine. We have both sugar pine and ponderosa, and I always tell people, and feel free to jump in and correct me, but I say the most valuable sugar pine or ponderosa pine standing on your property for aesthetic, because they're beautiful, trees. I mean, look at your front yard. I mean, that's all pretty much pine, isn't it? But at one point, pine was super valuable.
Yeah. They the big ponderosa, pine logs were. They did command a high price.
What were they being used for?
I think a lot of it was actually going to windows and doors before they went to composite. And so you had, really, really high value pine, ponderosa and sugar pine. But, today it's you almost have to give it away if you want to get rid of it off your property.
Yeah. You're
And
basically
so-
doing good to break even to have someone cut it down.
Exactly.
Well, if you're doing a big job with Doug fir, taking pine can actually start to make sense because you're already there and you're
Yeah.
making $100 a thousand or something, or 150 a thousand. Like, it could add up, especially if you're wanting to thin the whole.
And you're saying
property.
150, 1,000 board foot, just for the listeners.
Yeah. So basic. I'll do the layman's version of basic economics. You know, you have, I'll call it a pond value, or the value at the mill. So say it's $850 for fir, and then you have your logging cost and your haul cost. Those are the three things you need to pay attention to, you know, economic model. So if we just did the math on one the other day, but basically $850 a thousand for fir.
$850 per 1,000 board
Correct.
feet. And a board foot is?
Board foot is 12 inches by 12 inches by 1 inch thick is a board foot.
There you go.
There you go. So in that particular situation, we had roughly 600,000 board foot of Doug fir on this property, and it equated to roughly a $300,000, $280,000 net value. So we don't need to unpack that on the conversation of how we got there, but that's the economic side of, or if you want to unpack it, we could.
Yeah, no, I'm interested because I think, you know, when you're a little kid, you think about a lot of things, and it's like, oh man, being a logger, that sounds cool, like being outside. But like, how do you, like, if some guy wanted to go out here or, you know, somewhere in southern central Oregon and buy a timber tract, like you just kind of modeled out from a real estate agent working with a client perspective on how you do the math behind it. But like, how's that work? Do you just call up somebody like you, and what happens?
Yeah, I think, you know, if a person,
So this would be private, obviously.
This would be private.
The 75% of the logging that happens on private ground.
Well, take that job you're doing right now over here in Southwest Medford that we were just talking about.
yeah, and so you have a landowner who's got a piece of property, they have timber, it has a value, and they want to know what that value is. And so a lot of times the first step is getting that timber appraised. And so a person will come out, a consultant will come out, and they'll conduct a timber cruise. And so this is kind of the beginning of it. And so a timber cruise is where, you know, essentially you're taking measurements of the trees on that property to determine, you know, what kind of log volume you have out there. And so they're measuring size, you know, diameters, they're measuring tree heights, they're recording, you know, tree species, and they'll do that across the entire piece of property to come up with a volume. And, you know, you're looking at a net volume is the number that you're looking for. And so, you know, they're going to take into account defect. If there's any disease out there in the trees, they're looking for that. They're going to take into account any breakage. So, you know, if it's say if it's a steep piece of property, and when these trees, you know, get felled, they're actually accounting for, you know, looking at it and they're like, okay, you know, the top 20 feet is probably going to break out. You know, these trees aren't going to stay together all the way down when they fall. And so they're actually taking that into account as well. And so, you know, the cruiser will go in there and they'll give you a cruise. You'll figure out what you have for volume. And then, you know, the next step would be, okay, you know, trying to figure out what type of logging system you're going to use to harvest the timber. And so that really depends on the ground, the topography. And so, you know, if we're looking at flat ground, you're going to use a certain system. If you're looking at steep ground, you're going to use a different system.
And the two common things would just be mechanical harvest and then yarder harvest. Those, for lack of a better term.
Sure.
Mechanical is whether it's an actual fettler buncher. I'm saying that right?
Yeah. Yep.
Or you're, you know, cutting trees and then pulling them out with a cat or a skidder.
Yeah, and so you've got your ground-based or mechanical tractor logging. In the steeper ground, you've got what you call cable or yarder logging. And so obviously the steeper the ground, the more expensive your logging is going to be. And then, you know, so when you're trying to figure out what your logging systems are that you're going to use to harvest the timber, you also need to figure out, and I guess if we take a step back, before all of this, before the appraisal, you know, the landowner is going to need to determine what their objectives are going to be. So is this, you know, Are we going to try and maximize timber value, and are we going to go in and are we going to clear cut the property and then just plan to reforest and replant for another rotation? Or, do we want to come in and do a selective thin where, we're not going to take all of the timber volume, we're going to leave some behind? Do we want to thin, light enough to where we don't have to replant? Are we going to thin to, maximize your net value? And, by doing so, you may have to replant. And so there's all these different things that the landowner really needs to think about to determine what their, management objectives really are before, figuring out, what kind of logging system you're going to have, where you're going to sell the logs. And so once you have that, then you can go through the appraisal, figure out what, logging system you're going to use. When you have that, based on the type of timber you have on that property, not a lot of people know this or think about it, but there's a certain type of tree that makes a really good stud, and there's that tree might not make a really good, say, glulam beam or laminated veneer lumber. And so there's different qualities in trees that will sort of dictate where you can sell those trees. And so when you go into a stand, you really need to understand. You really need to know. Okay, I'm looking at a tree. This is going to make very good veneer for a laminated veneer product.
If I may jump in, here's the big deal on that. So your logging cost is virtually going to stay the same. Whether
your logging cost is like cut, haul.
No, just cut. Just the logging cost, the cost to get everything cut, virtually is going to stay the same. The big, levers you have to make a difference is if you can sell the logs at $850 here at Boise, in Medford, but you can send it up to somewhere up north for a specific niche, and you can send a few loads up there at $1,200. That's all margin. The difference between $850 and $1,200 is all margin.
Minus a little bit of trucking.
That's what I was just going to say. Yeah. Plus whatever your trucking is, you may still end up with a more significant margin. So there's these levers you can play with is what he's talking about as far as where to actually send the logs. That makes a huge difference because
that's part of the reason I drive down the highway out here, and I pass a logging truck going this way, and I'm like following a logging truck going this way.
Yeah, correct.
Could we not have all just gone that way? Or?
So like when you're sourcing meat or doing the different things that you do on a daily basis, he's doing the same thing. Like, okay, well, I can send this load here, I can do this, all to pull levers to maximize the return to the landowner.
Yeah, the yield and
correct.
Yeah, interesting.
Did I say that?
Yeah. I mean, there's really this sort of scale of quality and grades among timber, and so having the knowledge and ability to really market those logs. And so, you may have, say you have a 20
acre. Highest value return for each log.
Exactly. Yeah. So you may have multiple destinations for that timber, and you're trying to maximize each sort for that landowner.
Speaking of the logging trucks, we love to hunt, right? And so I spent a lot of time driving up these logging roads as I get to know the area. Sure. And some of them I'm driving up in my pickup, especially if it's slippery or whatnot. And I'm like, my goodness, they can drive a logging truck down this thing?
Those guys are crazy.
Yeah. I have a lot of respect for log truck drivers.
Switchbacks, ridiculously steep inclines.
Yeah.
There's no guardrails. That should be obvious to the listeners, but you're talking slopes as steep as you can picture. These guys are driving I don't know how much those logging truck weighs down a slippery slope in the middle of the winter. It's you got to have some cojones.
You do. Yeah, you do. Yeah. You picture those conditions, and add some snow and some ice, and it's like, oh my goodness, these guys are nuts.
Yeah. So I think, where do you fit into this whole equation? So you've painted the picture of kind of how a log cut works, but what is your role in that whole thing?
So I can, I've sort of wear multiple hats, I guess.
What's your official title? What do you call yourself?
I'm a forester. I'm a forester. And so,
And you're
there's,
an independent consultant.
so
you
I
work
do
for yourself.
consulting. I also buy logs for a sawmill up in Roseburg as well.
Okay.
So really, right now, what I mainly do is buy logs for a sawmill. So I'm out meeting with the landowners. Usually they'll already have things set up to where, I'm trying to figure out if it's a good fit for the facility as far as what timber they have out there.
Still standing, or it's already been decked?
It depends. Sometimes it's standing, sometimes it's decked, sometimes they're in the process of logging. And so, there's other times where I'm helping the landowner, as a consultant where, it's just a blank canvas. They've got a piece of property. They want to make money. They don't know how to do it. And so, we're out there, finding property lines, cruising, appraising, marketing the wood, getting it sold for the landowner. So kind of just the full meal deal for, a person trying to conduct a timber harvest.
Well, you guys can also write forest management plans for someone who may not want to do anything today, but wants to, maintain his property for the next 20 years and do it the right way, and with conservation and everything. Like, that's another big piece to it.
Exactly.
Let's jump into that and kind of switch gears for a second, because, living here for a brief amount of time, I can already tell pretty clearly that there's two types of people in the Northwest. There's people that want no trees cut, and there's people, and actually this is oversimplifying it, right? When there's people that want all trees cut. There's obviously the right answer is in between of like conservation, forest management, leave a little here to take a little bit over there. But can you unpack that dynamic briefly and kind of get to like best practices as you see it, and where logging fits in like a true forest management program?
Kind of from a conservation point of view.
Yeah, definitely from a conservation point of view.
Sure. Yeah, there are definitely two extremes. You have the hardcore environmentalists where, it is not going their way unless it's a hands-off approach and we're not cutting anything. You've got the very, very far extreme, clear-cut America. And then you've got really present day, timber industry where, they want, everybody wants to have this sustained yield where, they're harvesting, they're harvesting timber at a level that's sustainable in perpetuity. So, you've got loggers now who,
which is the basic premise of conservation.
Which is
Whether
the
we're
exact
talking about
premise.
elk numbers or tree numbers.
Exactly,
right?
exactly. I mean, everybody, we like to elk hunt, but we don't want to kill every single elk that's out there because we're not going to have anything to hunt, right? And so same thing with these loggers. They don't want to clear cut America because then they're not going to have anything to do. And so they want, they want a healthy forest. They don't want to see these, big tracts of timberland get developed and turned into housing, projects just like some of these environmentalists. But they are concerned with forest health, and part of that, one of the tools that you need is actually harvesting this timber and managing it, responsibly. And so the timber industry as a whole has really come a long way as far as how they view forestry and logging. And there were some things in the past that that weren't right. Clear cutting, blowing over fish creeks and all the rest. And so, people have learned and have sort of adapted their management strategies now to where we have some really good rules here in Oregon, forest practice rules and regulations. We've got some that don't make a lot of sense.
Hit the high points of the ones that do. I'm very interested in that.
Well, I mean, they don't want, high temperatures in the streams, right? We want cool streams for the fish. And so, leaving some trees along the creeks and the rivers is a good thing.
Provide shade for the water.
Provide
not
shade.
Only habitat, but keep the water cool for the anadromous fish that need it to migrate and spawn.
Exactly. Every once in a while, the dead trees will fall into the water, create some large woody debris, great habitat.
That's good.
Good stuff. Things that might not make sense is when those buffers are so large that the trees that do fall down are nowhere near nowhere near the streams. They're no longer providing shade. And so there are trade-offs there, but, Oregon actually has probably some of the most stringent forest practice rules and regulations in the country besides, California, but we're probably right there with Washington. And so really California, Oregon, and Washington have, the most stringent rules and regulations when it comes to forest practices. So, as a whole, the industry is doing a really good job today, as far as managing, forests. All these big timber companies, they're not trying to, you hear the term deforestation thrown around a lot. And I think for some of the listeners that don't really understand forest management, there isn't any deforestation going on in the state of Oregon. It's not like you see, down in the Amazon where they're clear cutting these rainforests and they're turning them into pastures. And I mean, that's deforestation. There's no longer a forest. What we're seeing here is industrial forestry where, yes, they're going to take out, an area of timber, but then they're going to put it back into timber, and in another, rotation, there's going to be, big trees ready to harvest again. And they're going to continue doing that, and they're going to manage it just like they would, say, with a crop of corn, or alfalfa. And so when you start to look at it as a crop and manage it as such, you realize that, the forests on the private aren't going away. They're, the people that own those lands and manage those lands want to see trees. And they don't want that, to turn into something else.
Well, and that brings up a good point between the two different kinds of people that I assume you're working with. I know I see on a regular basis is commercial forestry, and then the regular rancher, homesteader, private individual who happens to also have trees on his property. And there's oftentimes, a similar goal for sustainability, but one person significantly values aesthetic and game habitat and some of those other things, and another person is significantly values, obviously, keeping their doors open and paying the bills, and those are often looked two different ways. We're not going to have a ranch owner who likes to hunt and, truly owns his property for reasons other than profit. He's not going to clear cut. He's going to go in and he's going to select cut, and oftentimes those monies get reinvested right back into the ranch. That's what I've seen over and over where, you take $100,000 of logs out, you get $50,000 worth of road improvements, and you do $100,000 of fuels reduction and property improvement with the money you just made. Like, that's a super common thing we see where you got a $2 million property that, you're not buying it for timber, you're not owning it for timber, but the timber can be this great lever to improve the land. So I want to kind of, the dichotomy between the two mindsets, but it's the same general set of practices as far as the economics behind it.
Yeah. And so that is more of that industrial mindset, industrial management style. And yeah, exactly, Chris. The people that we work with a lot are the smaller timberland owners who they want to generate a little bit of revenue. They want to, promote the habitat for hunting and for recreation and that type of thing, fuels reduction, wildfire
fuels reduction,
resiliency.
That's a whole 5-episode podcast all on its own.
Yeah, hit
just
the
talking
highlights
about
on that, because one of the bumper stickers you see around here, let me get this right, it's, what is it? Graze it, log it, or watch it burn.
Yeah.
Obviously coming from a certain sect of the population, but still an interesting, I think
there's truth to that, though.
There is truth, and I think with some of the big fires, of the last few years on the West, the temperature has kind of swung a little bit more pro-logging because there's an understanding that these clear cuts do provide a fire break. There is an idea of forest management is important.
Yeah, especially down here in Southern Oregon. And in clear cut, it does provide those fire breaks. But even, what we see with these catastrophic wildfires, it's almost, every other year, every 3 years, we're seeing these major wildfires. And there's a ton of research that's been done, and you can see the difference how that fire reacts when it goes into a managed stand versus a stand that's been hands off, that hasn't had any management for quite a while, and so those landscape structures are different, and it's clear that in a managed stand you're seeing a lot lower intensity in those fires.
And an oversimplification of a managed stand versus a stand that's not managed literally comes down to undergrowth and brush. Like that's the biggest difference.
And thinning, right?
There's some stalking rate things, but even if the stalking rates were exactly the same as far as the big trees, and one was just a cleared out, all the fuels had been reduced underneath, and the other one was totally native, like the one's going to go up like a kindling box. The other is actually going to be a fire that could be fought reasonably, by crews.
Yeah, and so what really spurs bumper stickers like that is the fact that, going back to these decreased levels of harvest on our federal lands, the majority of Southern Oregon is, Forest Service or BLM, and it's a far greater ownership than the private timberlands here in our area.
It's like 2 to 1.
Yeah, maybe even more than that actually. But it, a lot of that ground isn't being treated. It's not being thinned. Very little is being done, and so these fires, because of that size of ownership, is occurring on these federal lands, and so we're seeing a lot of this federal land get burned, and you're seeing these resources that could provide jobs, that could provide money, to counties, to
Economic
schools,
drivers.
Exactly, all these things go up in smoke, burning up, habitat for wildlife, losing those, the shade trees for, the rivers and the streams in those areas. And so, you see those bumper stickers, and there is some truth to that. It's like, well, we got to do something or it's gonna burn. And in this area, very prone to wildfire.
Well, fire is a natural part of the ecosystem, right? It has been for as long as there's been trees in the Northwest. To me, again, as an outsider, it feels like the solution driven by the extremes, but ultimately meeting in the middle is forest management to support the economy, to provide jobs, to provide timber, because we all live in houses made of timber. We use timber products. I got timber products right here I'm taking notes on. And so, at some point there's a realization that we need the product, but also there's it's a win-win if we do it the right way, right? If we have an economy, an economic industry that's out there managing a resource that if we don't manage is going to cause us a problem, but if we do, it can actually benefit the economy. It feels like a no-brainer to have some strategic management going on both on private and public land.
Yeah.
One of the last pieces I really wanted to get into was specifically wildlife habitat, because when you harvest a timber cut, and most of what my experience in seeing is the clear cuts, there's this cycle of almost like a wildlife boom in a couple of years after the cut. Let me paint this in the way I see it, and you can tell me where I'm wrong. And so, a company goes in, they take the timber off, they clear cut it, and for a year or two, nothing really happens, but then they come in and they replant, and that third year seems to be the promised land for the elk and the deer and all the animals that come back in, because you've got a plethora of food for them. The trees are still small enough, there's light getting to the forest floor, so you've got huckleberries and blueberries and blackberries and all kinds of, woody material that these animals feed on, grasses for the elk. And then for 10 years, 15 years, it's kind of the perfect habitat zone.
Yeah.
But then those trees start to get big enough, they shade out all that habitat, or they shade out the forest floor. Mm-hmm. And so then it becomes this middle of the road impenetrable forest where there is no food until it gets to that old growth stage where it gets big enough, it's shaded out everything to a point, nothing grows underneath it, and you can actually walk through it really nice.
Yeah.
And then hunt it again.
Yeah.
So that's my perspective. How do you see all that in terms of the interface with wildlife on a cut?
I think that was a great way to put it, especially, from an outside perspective. those early years, there's not much, and then all of a sudden you have this explosion of growth and different species of brush and grass, and the trees are trying to compete with all of that stuff, and the wildlife does come in, and
It's a very similar effect to a burn.
it is.
Yeah.
It is.
Except for you actually got to use the resource before it
You
all.
do, yeah. Although, there are areas here in Southern Oregon that have now been reburned, 5-6 times even, to where, there isn't soil anymore for that regrowth to happen. And so
Just got too hot too many
it
times.
got too hot to where you're left with, literally just bare rock. And so you've got these, old humongous fire scars where it's just snags, maybe some brush that can grow, and so you've got these huge brush patches amongst these snags that'll reburn in another 3 to 5 years with the next lightning storm. Too dangerous to go in, and so they then it gets bigger, and then these fire scars just continue to grow and grow and grow because of that. And so the pattern of the reburn is really taking a toll on the soil health. And so, it's the regrowth after a wildfire does happen, but it's only able to happen for so long if there isn't any
Life in the soil.
in life in the soil, and if we don't have any human, if we don't interject ourselves to kind of help with that, and so a great picture of that is, we've had these Labor Day fires. This has been 4 years now, up every major drainage across the state. And so you go up the Umpqua River, outside of Roseburg, and I mean, just total devastation, private and federal ground, where you have these, stand replacing fires. Not a single tree made it. You've got, private on one side, you've got federal on the other, and the private guys went in, they salvaged what they could, and they replanted, and now we're seeing healthy trees grow. We're seeing grasses and the flowers and the berries, and then you're looking on the other side at the federal ground where, maybe they didn't do that, and it's still just snags, and it's still just the brush, and so.
And if we had any flooding rain events before that soil could kind of build back up, like you potentially
Major
are losing
erosion
it.
issues, yeah, and then you're losing all of that, that the topsoil and that organic matter on top, to where it makes it really tough for things to come back. And so, but exactly, like going back to what you were saying, it's there's so much going on in those first few years of what they call early sterile habitat, and it's pretty exciting to watch that. But yeah, and then it just kind of transitions into that older stand of timber. So,
Well, I think before we leave the wildlife habitat conversation for just a second, to shift gears, since we are in Southern Oregon, and talk about winter feed for a second. So, obviously the deer and elk come down out of the high country in the winter, get pushed down by snow or weather. And, forgive me, Lefi, but we're going to talk about oak trees for a minute. But, in that elevation between, say, 1,500 feet and 3,000 feet in Southern Oregon, we have a lot of, I'll call it oak savanna type ground, and that's a huge source of feed also for deer. And a lot of people don't think about it, but there's a lot you can do to manage your property, for wildlife feed in the wintertime, when you have, not just when you're in the conifers and in the evergreens, but when you have oak savanna type on your property, by removing, brush, actually thinning out some of the conifers in some situations to create a better habitat for those oaks and to bring the deer and elk into your property, whether you want for hunting purposes or just to, provide a good food source for wildlife. I think that's another thing. Have you done much forest management for specifically for wildlife habitat in that sensitive deer and elk winter kind of range?
not specifically for wildlife, but more of like a oak savanna restoration project, to where we were taking out, the Douglas fir, leaving some of those bigger, older pine trees, and then kind of creating that more open landscape, leaving all the oak trees, obviously, to promote that oak savanna, oak grove habitat.
Is there a market for oak? Like, do you guys cut oak or madrone or any like the low elevation?
It's the market isn't firewood for the hardwoods mostly. There is a hardwood mill in Eugene up north that from time to time they will actually buy white oak, but it's very rare. The madrone, you have your niche markets with kind of craft wood, figure wood, but it's not a industrial.
Also great firewood.
But the best firewood. Yeah, I mean,
super dense. For those who aren't familiar, I think it's in the magnolia family, but the wood is insanely heavy and dense and hard.
yeah.
And so when you use it as cut firewood, it burns forever.
It's clean,
Yeah.
super clean,
Super
Yeah.
clean, yeah.
high
Burns hot.
BTUs.
Yeah, silver madrone is like gold in Southern Oregon.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's best.
Anyway,
Well, this has been super interesting for me. I've learned a ton. Is there anything kind of on your heart or on your mind that we didn't get to that you want to share?
No, I mean this is great. Appreciate you guys having me, and it's been fun.
Yeah, I think it'd be fun. I mean, on my little farm here, I've got half of it is basically pastures and row crop ground, and then the other half is what I would call a forest, kind of riparian forest
Yeah.
in the river bottom. I'd love to walk around out here one day and have you tell me what you think about all that.
Yeah, no, that'd be great.
Cool. Well, it's great to meet you, and I'm sure this is the first of many. We have timber issues or timber conversations come up. You're gonna be the guy.
Give me a call.
Yeah, but it was great to meet you and work out and share some time fellowship this morning. And,
Absolutely.
we appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me.
all right. Thank you, sir.
Right on.